Under the supervision of Ismail Legrat, the students from ENSA focused their work on understanding how heavily dependent our transportation modes are on natural resources, the pressure this poses on our reserves, and the technological innovations that have the potential to alleviate some of that dependency. Representing ENSA, I am pleased to welcome Abir Mesbahi.
Thank you, Cecilia. How can we satisfy the mobility needs of 8 billion people while safeguarding our environment? Our overuse of natural resources causes land degradation, water scarcity, and soaring air pollution. Thus, greater levels of innovation are imperative. My engineering classmates and I have done our research to develop a vision based on scientific evidence. A look at 3 main energy sources currently used and planned gives us a good picture of an important aspect of the world's mobility journey. First, petroleum fuel has served us in the past, powering traditional vehicles, and has become a major contributor to CO2 emissions due to its widespread use. Global oil consumption increased almost 9-fold since 1950 and roughly doubled since 1980. The rate at which we are consuming this fossil energy source will lead to the depletion of the Earth's natural resources. Therefore, petroleum cannot be our fuel for the future. However, until we transition away from it, we suggest deploying advanced seismic imaging technologies to better understand subsurface reservoirs, thereby minimizing drilling and environmental impacts. Second, lithium-ion batteries expected to see a 27% annual growth in demand by 2030. Power electric vehicles will generate significantly lower carbon emissions when driven. Yet lithium, another finite natural resource, might eventually face scarcity issues when used at full scale. This questions the long-term viability of this solution for meeting mobility needs and calls for coordinated efforts in battery use and disposal, for example, through global design and production standards. Lastly, green hydrogen offers a clean alternative for the future. Yet, its production is costly and requires significant amounts of water and sustainable energy. For example, London to New York flights fueled by green hydrogen-based kerosene would consume as much water as 1,800 US citizens do in a day. Innovative solutions such as hydrogen hubs are needed to reduce costs. Achieving full sustainability requires further innovation like integrated water recycling and treatment systems to support reuse. While transitioning to more sustainable energy sources, we still need to protect our planet, as the production process of these sources can lead to environmental and social hazards. Immediate efforts to reduce the use of natural resources, prioritize recycling and reuse, and bolster public transportation are imperative. Besides, we must raise awareness of more responsible ways of mobility and opt for global standards. So, I'm pleading with everyone to not be satisfied with our current pace of change. We must urgently innovate to minimize the destruction of our planet and protect our future. The time for action is now. Should we prioritize innovation-driven solutions for resource-efficient mobility, even if it means disrupting traditional industries and livelihoods?
Thank you for that summary and for your challenge, Abir. Can you please pose your first question to Roberto?
We see electric mobility as the best solution today to reduce our consumption of fossil fuel. How, when we speed up the shift to electric mobility, will we handle the demand for lithium the batteries will produce?
Well, thank you very much for the question. Very interesting. Congratulations for your work. I think there are many critical issues here. I think it's not true that electric mobility is the best solution. many studies do not corroborate with this vision. I think, and some colleagues of mine also think like that, this is very much a kind of a global north perspective. But the world is much bigger than the global north. Just to put this into perspective, some 800 million people in the world today do not have access to electricity. And many more do not have access to stable electricity. So how can you think about electricity for powering vehicles if you don't have even electricity for more than 800 million people to do other things than mobility? So for sure, electric mobility is not the solution, at least in the next 20 or 30 years, when we really need to go to net zero. So I don't think electricity is the solution for mobility. So if, let's say, electricity is not a solution for replacing mobility, what can we do in that case? Because we have to think about, let's say, energy poverty, transportation poverty is a real thing in the global south and in the globe as well. So we have to have in mind that there is no one size fits all when it comes to mobility. So for some places, for some people, eventually non-motorized mobility may be one of the solutions. Public transportation, for sure, is probably the best solution. And in that case, public transportation may or may not be electric. And even if you use electricity for public transportation, this doesn't mean that we have to rely on batteries, because we already have other electric technologies available for public transportation. So eventually this will not put let's say, too much impact on, for example, lithium that we have mentioned. For other places, I would mention, for example, Central America, South America, and even Africa, drop-in biofuels is a much, much better solution than electric vehicles. Why? Simply because drop-in biofuels mean that you can use the existing motorization in the existing fuels, in the existing, let's say, cars and buses, using an alternative fuel, which I think is much, much better than electricity, because if you think about the climate emergency, the need to go to net zero, if you go to electricity for mobility, at most you can go to zero. If you rely on biofuels, you can go to negative emissions. And in that case, you can compensate for those emissions that will happen anyway in other sectors of our economy. So biofuels is also a possibility.
So thank you for that, Roberto.
Even when you talk about, I'm almost done.
Okay.
Yes.
So thank you for that. We're gonna get to the public transportation and a couple of those in a moment. So thank you for those opening comments. But Manal, I want you to hop in for a moment. So while Roberto thinks that EVs aren't the solution, but we're on the path to doing that right now. So what role could AI play in accelerating, if we wanted to do that, to make the acceleration to the transition to EVs? How would we handle that?
Yeah, so hi, Cecilia. First of all, I'd like to congratulate the team on the excellent research. I do agree with Roberto that electric vehicles might not be the best option in many locations in the world, but we know that a lot of nations, especially developed ones like Europe and the US and perhaps Australia, are moving towards net zero emissions by using electric vehicles. And within these nations, as the shift towards electric mobility accelerates, AI does emerge as a vital ally in managing the soaring demand for lithium, essentially for electric vehicle batteries. Through its capabilities, AI can optimize the lithium extraction and processing by employing predictive analytics, for example, for pinpointing deposit locations and enhancing process efficiencies. So this not only makes extraction more sustainable, but also maximizes yield with minimal environmental impact. Now, in the realm of battery recycling, AI can revolutionize the process through advanced sorting and extraction techniques, ensuring that valuable materials from spent batteries are efficiently recovered, reintegrated into the production cycle. Now, this significantly reduces the need for fresh lithium extraction, which aligns with sustainability goals. Furthermore, AI's power in supply chain and demand forecasting would enable a smarter allocation of resources and informed decision-making. By accurately predicting lithium supply and demand scenarios, AI can facilitate the dynamic demand management, optimizing the use of lithium, smoothing out potential supply bottlenecks. In the venue of sustainable practices, AI can also champion sustainable practices within the lithium supply chain. It can monitor environmental, social, and governmental standards, ensuring compliance and promoting the exploration of alternative materials that could mitigate the environmental impact associated with lithium extraction. So in summary, AI can have the potential to significantly mitigate the challenges associated with the growing demand of lithium.
So thank you for that. So I'm sensing the urge of the panelists to jump into the conversation of alternative fuels, but we can't leave EVs just yet. We have already a number of questions from our audience, and so I want to give other panelists an opportunity to jump in. Carlos, you're an obvious one to jump in on this conversation. What do you think about the transition to EVs?
Well, thank you, Cecilia. This is a fascinating discussion, and I would agree with Manal and Roberto that we should move away from a dogmatic thinking where one size fits all. I don't think this is going to work. What I would like to add is that the current EVs, and indeed they can be a solution for some of our societies, they need a very significant breakthrough in terms of chemistry. Right now, for a decent range, we are using 1,000 pounds, i.e. around 500 additional kilograms of raw materials to create a battery pack to move the vehicles. And of course, from an environmental standpoint, adding 1,000 pounds of additional raw materials doesn't look like a very reasonable outcome. So it's clear that the industry, based on new chemistries, needs to achieve in the next decade a breakthrough in terms of power density of the cells so that we reduce by at least 50% the weight and the raw material usage of EVs. And I think that's on the way. I think over the next decade, we'll be able to reduce the battery pack weight by 50%, hence reducing by 50% the use of additional raw materials against a conventional vehicle. I think that is going to give, indeed, as Manal was mentioning, a better solution, a better direction to e-mobility. Right now, I don't think it makes sense to put 1,000 additional pounds of raw materials to have a distant range of 400 kilometers. But I think that paradigm is going to be broken over the next decade by a new chemistry, which, by the way, hopefully will solve the problem of the scarcity of lithium. This is my addition to this debate. Thank you.
So we've been talking a little bit around the lithium and things like that. But EVs, there was a question that comes up about range and really around infrastructure charging. So do we have adequate infrastructure to support this transition, even if the materials become more sustainable? Anyone have thoughts on what we think about the infrastructure investment that's required to support a shift to EVs? So I think, Carlos, I think you might have something more to say on that.
Well, the investment is huge, as we can understand. Just count the number of pumps you have right now in a gas station. Consider that charging an EV will take 3 or 4 more times more time, and therefore you just multiply by that factor all the filling stations, pumps that you have right now. So it's a very, very big investment, and it's more than that. What we have seen from the survey that was presented is people do not want to impact their convenience, and we have to find technologies and solutions that do not impact their convenience. That means that the charging network density needs to be highly visible. It needs to come your way instead of you looking for it. which means that when you go to university, when you go to the office, when you go to the restaurant, when you go to gym, when you go to the supermarket, you need to find those charging units in the parking lots, which then means a lot of investment, also a lot of carbon footprint. So I think this is one of the big challenges, is to make sure that those charging stations are visible, that they are accessible, and that the societies will not pay an enormous investment. That is, for me, an as big a challenge as the one we already have to reduce the weight of the EEs, without forgetting one thing that I didn't mention, is we have right now 1.3 billion internal combustion engine vehicles on the planet, 1.3 billion. And we are only talking about the 85 million new car sales of every year. We did not yet bring a solution, which may be e-fuels for the existing park, because we are not going to ask people to stop being mobile. That would not work, socially speaking.
Thank you. So Matthias, I think you want to jump in on the conversation as well. So Matthias, I'm going to ask you, we can't hear you just yet, so I'm going to go to Roberto really briefly, and then we'll come back to you, Matthias.
Yeah, just very briefly, we have to add to this problem the extra burden you're going to put in the power sector. So not only we have to have charging stations, but we have to put a lot of installed capacity to charge those cars. So this is an extra burden and extra investment need that we have to think about. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So let's see, Matthias, if we can get back to you again. We didn't hear you the last time. Let's see, do you want to jump in?
Sure, thank you very much.
Thanks.
So I want to bring in a perspective that questions the focus on technological solutions and electric mobility regarding the countries, the wealthy countries in the global north. And studies here are quite clear. The world cannot produce the amount of sustainable energy in time and provide all the necessary resources and materials for everyone globally to participate in the car-centered mobility regime of the US and Europe. This imperial mode of living, as it's called in the social sciences, relies on appropriation of resources and labor and on externalizing its cost. It cannot be universalized. And it's absurd that more than half of the new cars sold in countries such as Germany are actually SUVs. This is in the middle of the climate and biodiversity emergence. Instead of using the largest share of global resources to sell ever bigger and more comfortable electric cars to drive around the cities of Europe and other wealthy nations, I think climate justice actually means using the resources where they are really needed for establishing transport infrastructures to realize the right for mobility for everyone in the global south. And a key precondition for this is not technological, but rather social, a paradigm shift to end car dependency in general.
Great, thank you for that. So I think we've done with our EV conversation, and I want to move on to where a few of you started beforehand. Let's take our second question that we've gotten from both the students and a number of our audience. How do we, and this is going to go to Carlos first, how do we make the transition to green hydrogen given the infrastructure required to produce it and the need for mobility vehicles to be able to use it? So you did talk about this transition and potentially some others, but Abir mentioned in her remarks that they believe that green hydrogen is next as a viable alternative. What do you think about that? Carlos, let's start with you.
Well, I think that hydrogen is based on the same solution as EVs in terms of getting a renewable energy and having a clean energy. Being for EVs as much as for hydrogen-based vehicles, you need clean energy so that you can produce that hydrogen. Of course, hydrogen is bringing much more convenience because it's much faster to charge, and it will be a little bit easier to package. But once you benefit from this convenience, and once you make the assumption that the energy that you are using to produce hydrogen is clean, you still have an enormous challenge of cost. Right now, we see that the technology for mobility hydrogen-based is twice more expensive as the electric vehicles. which then means that we are very far from the conventional technology. So I'm afraid that for the time being, affordability is going to be a major showstopper for hydrogen, but possibly for the fleets, for the big fleets that come to the garage every day, we can justify the investment of one hydrogen charging unit for big corporations, but still it's going to be far from being affordable. But it is much more convenient as you can charge a tank of hydrogen in approximately 3 to 4 minutes. So its convenience is better, cost is sky high, and I think for the near future it's going to be a solution for fleet of big corporations, but certainly not for the normal citizens.
Thank you. And Roberto, I'd like you to jump in here because you started in your remarks earlier to talk about alternatives to EVs. So if we could talk about green hydrogen first and then potentially some of the other solutions that you think are appropriate, that'd be great.
Thank you, Cecilia. Very briefly, as of today, more than 90% of all hydrogen produced in the world is not green, comes from fossil fuels. So this is one important thing. When you talk about green hydrogen, we have to have in mind as well that we need more energy to produce hydrogen than the energy we have in hydrogen itself. So from an energy perspective, it's really not a good solution. And also add to the fact that hydrogen is extremely dangerous. It's very dangerous to have hydrogen in a car because you do not see if the car is, let's say, if you have fire, explosion. So I don't think hydrogen is a solution for cars, except if you think about fuel cells using hydrocarbons from biofuels or even fossil fuels, where you produce hydrogen in the car, but not putting hydrogen in the car, in the gas station. So I think it's very problematic. Final comment, Cecilia, very briefly. We cannot fly an airplane from London to New York with hydrogen. The energy density of hydrogen is too low. So you're going to use more space in the airplane to put hydrogen than to have space. So I don't think hydrogen is really a good solution, at least before 2050. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And now I'd like to ask Majora to jump into the conversation. Majora, we can't hear you right now. So.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
So anyway, I wanted to thank you all because this is such a fascinating discussion. But I kind of want to go back to something that Matthias had said, which is how do we bring this idea of community back into these discussions and making sure that we're keeping that front and center, because we know, bottom line is, if the economy had been clean and green a long time ago, if we had been building the kind of infrastructure, whether it's waste or energy or anything else, in higher status communities, but it hasn't been. And we now have an opportunity to rethink that as we're going forward. So that's really the thing that's coming to mind.
Yes, thank you for that. So any other conversation on alternative fuel? Matthias, how about you hop in?
I mean, thank you very much. I think just a very short thought, also coming from the debate we are having around this in Germany, where basically the electric car industry is quite advanced, and there's a lot more opportunity for universalizing electric mobility based on, or car mobility based on electric mobility than on other types of alternative fuels. There are still people advocating for alternative fuels, even though they're mainly used for basically racing cars or similar cars for the very rich. I think it's in actually addressing the overall challenge of climate change, we really need to focus on those solutions that can work in bringing mobility to the many, rather than on solutions that just work for the very, very few. One more thought on aviation. I think it's very important to also bring the question of aviation into the discussion. There is basically no technological solutions for decarbonizing aviation in time. So I think with regard to aviation, we really need to think about how we can change our social habits to make flying as necessary. There's no other way decarbonize the entire mobility sectors without flying less. In particular, for the very rich are those who are currently those who are using most of the emissions for aviation.
Thank you for that. And Roberto, I want to ask you a specific question because I think I heard you mention in an earlier conversation a piece around the infrastructure, the cars themselves or the boats and the planes. If we talk about alternative fuels, what the challenge might be as we think about that transition. Can you make a comment on that?
Yes, and I'm going to connect with what was just said by Matthias. In fact, we have to think about if the crisis we're going through now means being net zero by 2050, we have to think about drop-in solutions for the short term. And in that case, if you talk about shipping or aviation, and even, let's say, we have to talk about road cars and buses, etc., the only solution we have on hand and is well tested is drop-in biofuels. We have today, in Central, in Latin America, millions and millions of cars running on ethanol or green diesel, etc., etc. We also already have planes flying on alcohol-to-jet fuel. Also, we have ships running on biofuels. So I think it's not a solution for all, but as of today, for specific routes, specific places, biofuels is the only way to do the job before we think about new motorization and new fuels to solve the climate problem.
Thank you. Carlos, why don't you hop in and respond to that one?
Yes, I would like to share my perspective on what Roberto just said. Indeed, ethanol-based fuel has proven to be a very good solution in Brazil, and I think it's one good solution. We need to also be mindful that at any point in time, biofuels cannot be opposed to food and to agriculture because it needs also a significant amount of land to be grown. So ethanol-based fuels, biofuels is a good solution among the portfolio of solutions that pragmatically we need to use. And I agree that with a reasonable situation like we know today in Brazil, it works. And it works as well as an EV with a European energy mix. So the carbon footprint is quite efficient. It is one of the solutions we have. Nevertheless, if we were to think about other regions of the world, we would have to make sure that development is not going to oppose food production and agriculture production, because we also need that, of course, for the growing population on this planet. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to move on to a new topic, similar in this same technology area that the students brought up. And again, we had questions from the audience on this related to the circular economy. So what can be done to move the mobility industry towards a more circular economy to reduce the consumption of natural resources and the generation of waste? So let's start with Matthias, if you want to hop in on this one.
Sure, thank you very much. I think this is definitely a key challenge, moving to circularity overall in the mobility sector. And probably the easiest or the most efficient way is to, and I'll talk about this later a bit more, to have less cars. I think this is one of the key preconditions for actually closing the circles to move towards public mobility, in particular in cities. Otherwise, I think it's very, very important to rethink the ownership models in the entire car industry to really enable consumers and the producers to close the circles full circle. But I think the idea that a circular economy can be fully closed and we thus prevent the overuse of resources, this is a false idea that will not work out. There's no full recycling. There's always some downcycling happening, and it's just not possible. So we also need to reduce the overall consumption of resources in the entire mobility sector. And this obviously raises important global justice challenges and demands us thinking about where to put the efforts in ramping up mobility and maybe also where this effort shouldn't go, in particular in those countries, as I mentioned before, where there's already a lot of mobility happening. So I think the overall consumption needs to be downscaled in terms of the resources used.
Great, thank you for that. And I think there's two questions that those comments raise that we've seen from some of the audience's questions as well. One is this idea, when you think about circular economy, we've got situations where vehicles that are produced in the global north, after they're old, they become exports into global south communities. Who would like to talk about the challenges that might actually present of moving cars that are 20 years old and having that be a primary source of mobility in the global south? I think, Roberto, I think you had some comments on that.
Yes, Cecilia, very briefly, I think by moving old cars to the global south, we are also moving the problem, one more problem to the global south. So I have to agree 100% with Matthias that the real solution for the circular economy, for materials consumption, is to reduce consumption. If a population of 8 billion people heading to 10 billion people, we cannot keep the same standards of living we have in the global north and try to reproduce that in the global south. Either we have to decrease the consumption in the global north to give more space to the global south, or we have to really rethink everything. It's not reasonable to think about, let's say, cars being sold every year, and then you sell your car in 1 year time, 2 years time. So this is a problem that goes far beyond the mobility problem. It's a consumption problem that we also have to address much better than we have been doing so far.
And Majora, I know that there's challenges when we think about recycling and circular economy. There's some implications in urban areas, for example. Why don't you share your perspective on this?
Yeah, and I need to sort of frame it within the context of a question to my esteemed panelists, because in part it is the communities, the lower status communities, that will be the ones who are dealing with whether they're lower status countries that are getting these old cars that are no longer of value here, but what we also, I think, need to get to the root of is how do we, do you think it's a policy issue or a policy question, rather, that will allow us to be able to literally limit the harm that our countries are doing? And I apologize on behalf of what America actually sends over to the global south. In terms of how do we create the type of literal whether they're regulations, could it be nudging, to help people see the value of it? This is more of a question to you all, like how do we get it so that there aren't eventually cars that are well past their prime even going to those places?
Yes, thank you for that. Somebody want to respond to that? Let's see, maybe Carlos? Oh, let's try that again. Can we try Carlos again?
Sorry,
okay.
I was muted, of course. Thank you for the great question, Majora. I just would like to add, in the context of your question, a compliment to what Matthias said. Obviously, circular economy is not 100%, I would say, recycling and getting back all the materials, because you need energy for that, and energy potentially may not be totally clean. So circular economy is not the silver bullet, but circular economy has a huge potential to align all the stakeholders. It aligns the economic stakeholders, it aligns the consumers, and it can align the trends of the societies because it's not punitive. And we need to be very careful that if we want the support of everybody, and we need the support of everybody to get this done, we should favor policies, initiatives that are not punitive. And circular economy is certainly not punitive. It's going to move us away from excess of complexity. It's going to give us a good positive conscience. It can be potentially very trendy, and it is going to align the interest of the economic sector with the citizens and the other stakeholders. So potentially, the circular economy is something that may align all the stakeholders, I would say, without so much effort and with a great benefit to the planet. So I'm very worried that we are going to move everything in the direction of regulations. And the more we go on the regulatory side, the more we may have pushback from the citizens and not a positive support to change the life in the communities, as you were mentioning a few moments before. So that's just my added comment to your great question. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Carlos. And as we think about wrapping up this first segment, we already see that looking at even something like a discussion around technology, that we've got lots of things to consider. One, there's a push today to move towards electrification of everything and a push to have EVs become the primary solution to our mobility challenges. But from our discussion, we've already heard that there's concern with that. One, with what it does to our environment, and two, whether or not electric vehicles are actually affordable and accessible to all. As we think about alternative solutions in terms of fuels, there's lots of concern about how you make that transition, what is effective, and we see that there might not be a single solution for everything. And finally, as we think about things from a circular economy perspective, we've got to make sure that there's some equity in what we do with the resources, how we consume them, and perhaps the need to consume less so that we have less in circulation. So with that, let us now move on to the second part of this debate, the business dimension.